In the years leading up to 1861, the United States presented itself as a nation of contradictions. It was a democracy built on ideals of freedom and equality, yet nearly 4 million people were held in bondage, treated as property rather than citizens. At the same time, the country was rapidly industrializing in the North, while the Southern economy remained heavily dependent on agriculture and slave labor. Conventional narratives often assert that the Civil War was fought primarily to end slavery, a moral crusade against an inhumane institution. This interpretation has dominated textbooks and public memory for over a century. But as we examine the period more closely, difficult questions arise. If slavery was the sole cause, why did the Confederacy explicitly cite economic and political grievances in its declarations of secession? How did tariffs, trade disputes, and the expansion of infrastructure intersect with the institution of slavery to create sectional tension? And why did decades of compromise fail to prevent war despite the morally urgent debate over human bondage? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. The sectional divisions of the United States in the mid-19th century were deep, multifaceted, and both economic and moral in nature. The Southern states relied on a plantation system built on slave labor, producing cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice for both domestic and international markets. Cotton, in particular, had become central to global trade, linking Southern planters to textile industries in Britain and the northern United States. Slavery was not only a social institution, but also a crucial economic engine. The wealth of Southern elites depended on it, and the region's political influence was often tied directly to the value of enslaved labor. This economic reliance meant that any threat to slavery was perceived not just as a moral or social challenge, but as an existential risk to the Southern way of life. Meanwhile, the North experienced rapid industrialization and urbanization. Factories, railroads, and canals transformed the economy, providing opportunities for wage labor and capital accumulation outside the plantation system. Northern leaders and business interests increasingly advocated for protective tariffs to shelter emerging industries and investments in infrastructure to facilitate trade and migration. These policies often conflicted with Southern interests, which favored low tariffs to encourage cotton exports and feared federal overreach into regional affairs. The divergence in economic priorities contributed to a sense of mutual suspicion. Northern reforms were seen in the South not only as ideological threats, but also as challenges to the economic foundations of slavery. Political disputes magnified these economic tensions. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all designed to maintain a delicate balance between free and slave states. Yet each compromise failed to resolve underlying conflicts. Northerners increasingly saw the expansion of slavery into new territories as incompatible with free labor principles and the nation's economic trajectory. Southerners, by contrast, feared that curbing the expansion of slavery would eventually undermine their economic and political power. These competing visions of the nation created a zero-sum dynamic in which compromise became increasingly untenable. It is also essential to consider the role of political representation and the balance of power. The 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for congressional apportionment, amplified Southern political influence. This arrangement ensured that slaveholding states could exert disproportionate power in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. As the North's population grew, Southern leaders feared being permanently outnumbered and politically marginalized. Economic concerns, particularly the protection of the plantation system, were inseparable from this struggle over representation and influence. Northern attitudes toward slavery were similarly complex. While moral opposition to slavery existed, economic considerations shaped the debate as well. Northern industrialists and small farmers worried that the expansion of slave labor into new territories could depress wages and limit opportunities for free labor. Abolitionist rhetoric often intertwined with concerns about competition, labor markets, and economic modernization. In other words, moral arguments against slavery did not exist in isolation. They were embedded in broader discussions about the nation's economic future. This complexity challenges the idea that the Civil War was solely a moral crusade. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 crystallized these tensions. Lincoln and the Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, but initially promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Nevertheless, Southern leaders perceived his election as a direct threat to their economic and political interests. Within months, South Carolina and other states began the process of secession, citing both the threat to slavery and broader grievances over federal policies and perceived Northern aggression. Declarations of secession explicitly mention the protection of property and economic institutions, revealing that the Southern elite viewed slavery as intertwined with their regional prosperity and political autonomy. International dimensions further complicate the story. Britain and France, heavily dependent on Southern cotton, were economically invested in the continuation of slavery. Yet public opinion in Europe increasingly framed the conflict in moral terms, celebrating the potential end of human bondage. The global economy made the Southern states' economic position both powerful and precarious. Reliance on a single commodity and institution made the region vulnerable to geopolitical shifts, trade disruptions, and industrial competition from the North. This international lens demonstrates that the war was not only about domestic morality or economics, but also about how global markets and trade shaped internal divisions. The economics of transportation and infrastructure also played a role. The North's investment in railroads, canals, and emerging telegraph networks allowed rapid movement of goods, capital, and people, facilitating industrial growth. The South lagged behind in infrastructure investment, in part because capital was concentrated in land and enslaved labor rather than in industrial or transport development. This divergence heightened sectional disparities and created conflicting visions of national development. Economic modernization in the North was inseparable from the political debates over the expansion of slavery. Each side viewed the other as model incompatible with its own survival. Even within the South, opinions were not monolithic. Small farmers, urban workers, and non-slave-holding whites often had mixed perspectives on slavery, economics, and federal policy. While elite planters emphasized the necessity of maintaining slavery for economic survival, other groups sometimes prioritized access to land, political representation, or local autonomy. These internal divisions highlight that the conflict was not only sectional, but also social and economic within regions, complicating the narrative of a simple moral dichotomy. Cultural and ideological factors amplified economic disputes. Southern society was organized around a hierarchical structure in which slavery was both an economic institution and a social norm. Northern ideology, influenced by liberal and free labor principles, increasingly viewed this hierarchy as incompatible with modern Republican values. Newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets circulated widely, shaping perceptions of both morality and economic necessity. The intersection of ideology, economic interest, and political power made compromise increasingly difficult. The decades-long debate over tariffs and trade also influenced sectional tensions. Southern states consistently opposed high tariffs that protected Northern manufacturers, arguing that such policies disproportionately harmed agricultural exports. Northern manufacturers, conversely, argued that tariffs were necessary for industrial growth. These disagreements, while seemingly about trade policy, were intimately connected to the larger questions of economic structure, regional power, and the preservation of slavery. Southern leaders interpreted Northern economic priorities as a threat to the very institution that underpinned their wealth, further intertwining morality and economics in the lead-up to war. As we continue exploring this period, it becomes clear that the Civil War cannot be explained by a single cause. Slavery was undoubtedly central, but the institution itself was inseparable from economic interests, political power, social hierarchy, and global trade. Each of these factors interacted with the others, creating a complex web of incentives and fears. Understanding the war requires examining these connections, not just the moral arguments or the symbolic battles. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the sectional debates, legislative conflicts, and political crises that transformed ideological tension into open conflict. The years immediately preceding the outbreak of the Civil War illustrate just how deeply intertwined economic and moral considerations had become in American politics. The debates over new territories and states, particularly whether they would allow slavery, were not abstract moral exercises, they had concrete economic implications. Southern planters feared that free states in the West would tilt the balance of power in Congress, threaten their control over trade, and eventually restrict the expansion of the slave system that underpinned their prosperity. Northern leaders, conversely, argued that tariffs were necessary for industrial growth. These disagreements, while seemingly about trade policy, were intimately connected to the larger questions of economic structure, regional power, and the preservation of slavery. Southern leaders interpreted Northern economic priorities as a threat to the very institution that underpinned their wealth, further intertwining morality and economics in the lead-up to war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers in those territories to determine whether slavery would be permitted, triggered violent conflict and national outrage. Known as Bleeding Kansas, the struggle saw pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clash with deadly consequences. While morality framed the public debate, underlying economic stakes were enormous. Control of new territories meant control of land, trade routes, and access to labor systems that could support either plantation agriculture or free labor industries. Southern elites feared that the expansion of free states would undermine the political and economic equilibrium that had allowed the slave economy to coexist with Northern industry. At the same time, the issue of tariffs intensified sectional conflict. Protective tariffs in the North encouraged industrial growth by shielding fledgling manufacturers from foreign competition, but they raised the costs of imported goods for Southern consumers and exporters. Southern states argued that such tariffs disproportionately benefited the North at the South's expense. The Tariff of 1828, infamously labeled the Tariff of Abominations, and subsequent tariff disputes exemplify how trade policy became entangled with slavery debates. Southern leaders framed economic grievances in terms of constitutional rights and state sovereignty, linking the protection of slavery with broader economic autonomy. These disputes were not merely moral disagreements, but were rooted in real differences in economic structure and interest. Political representation was another critical factor. The South's influence in the federal government was disproportionately amplified by the 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for congressional appointment. This gave Southern states more votes in the House of Representatives and a stronger presence in the Electoral College than their free population would have otherwise justified. As the Northern population grew, the South feared being permanently outnumbered, threatening both political influence and the economic system that depended on slavery. These fears were evident in Southern rhetoric and declarations of secession, which repeatedly emphasized the protection of property rights, including the property represented by enslaved individuals. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 further inflamed sectional tensions by ruling that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The Supreme Court effectively sanctioned the expansion of the slave economy. Northern abolitionists and free soil advocates interpreted this as a judicial endorsement of Southern economic and political dominance. Southern leaders, conversely, saw the ruling as a vindication of their right to maintain and expand the institution of slavery, which they argued was essential to their economic survival. This legal dimension demonstrates how law, morality, and economics were deeply intertwined in shaping the path to war. It is also crucial to consider the role of transportation and infrastructure. The North's investment in railroads, canals, and emerging telegraph networks facilitated the growth of industry and the integration of regional markets. The South, with capital concentrated in land and enslaved labor, lagged behind in industrial and infrastructural development. This disparity heightened sectional differences, creating economic dependence on agricultural exports and limiting internal economic diversification. Southern leaders increasingly feared that Northern economic dominance would translate into political dominance, threatening the very foundation of the slave economy. These concerns revealed that economic structures were inseparable from the broader debates over slavery and federal authority. International trade added another layer of complexity. Southern cotton fueled textile industries in Britain and France, giving the Confederacy confidence that global markets would support its economy in the event of secession. However, reliance on a single commodity made the Southern economy vulnerable to price fluctuations and trade disruptions. Northern industrialists sought to expand domestic markets and reduce dependence on Southern raw materials, creating competing economic visions. These differences were not merely about money, they reflected divergent ideas of development, labor, and national identity. The international dimension underscores that the conflict was influenced not just by domestic morality, but by economic strategies that had global consequences. Even within Southern society, economic interests were not uniform. While large planters had the most to gain from the preservation of slavery, smaller farmers and non-slave-holding whites often supported the system for social status, local security, and the promise of upward mobility. Many believed that slavery underpinned a hierarchical order that protected them from economic marginalization. Northern opposition to slavery, therefore, was interpreted not only as a moral critique, but as a threat to the South's economic and social structures. This intersection of economics, ideology, and social order made compromise increasingly untenable. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the country had reached a point where economic and moral questions were inseparable from political action. Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery was framed in terms of free labor and national development rather than immediate abolition in the South. Yet Southern leaders viewed his election as an existential threat to their economy, political influence, and social order. Within weeks, South Carolina and other states began the process of secession, citing both the threat to slavery and broader grievances over federal authority and Northern economic policies. These simultaneous concerns reveal that the causes of secession were both moral and economic, reflecting the complex entanglement of interest, ideology, and power. As we continue, the next section will explore the outbreak of war itself, the early military campaigns, and how economic imperatives shaped both Northern and Southern strategies. by examining the ways in which industrial capacity, resource distribution, and logistical considerations influence the conflict, we can further illuminate how deeply economic concerns underpinned the moral debates that framed public memory of the Civil War. This approach allows us to understand the war not as a simple moral crusade or economic struggle, but as a convergence of both, played out on a national and global stage. As the Civil War erupted in 1861, the entanglement of economic imperatives and moral claims became immediately evident on the battlefield, in political strategy, and in the social fabric of both North and South. Military campaigns were not only influenced by ideology, but also by the material realities of each region. The North, with its industrial base, rail networks, and diversified economy, could mobilize troops, weapons, and supplies on a scale the South struggled to match. Northern factories produced rifles, cannons, uniforms, and ammunition in vast quantities, while railroads facilitated the rapid movement of soldiers and equipment. This industrial advantage reflected more than mere logistics. It shaped the Union's strategic options and provided leverage in wartime decision-making. Conversely, the South's reliance on cotton exports and a largely agrarian economy constrained its ability to sustain prolonged conflict. The Confederacy hoped that cotton would compel European intervention, leveraging economic influence to secure political recognition and military support. The failure of this strategy underscores how economic calculations were inseparable from political and military decisions during the war. Financing the war presented distinct challenges for both sides. The Union had access to a more sophisticated banking system, the ability to levy tariffs, and the means to issue bonds to finance military expenditures. Northern economic power allowed the federal government to maintain the war effort, even as costs skyrocketed. In the South, the Confederacy struggled with limited resources, inadequate banking infrastructure, and a smaller industrial base. Confederate leaders resorted to printing money, leading to severe inflation that eroded public confidence and undermined civilian morale. These financial realities demonstrate that the success or failure of wartime policies was intimately linked to economic capacity, not solely to the moral righteousness of each side's cause. Agriculture and labor practices played a central role as well. In the South, the institution of slavery remained a critical economic pillar throughout the war. Enslaved labor was not only a source of agricultural production, but also a tool for military logistics, as enslaved people were often forced to construct fortifications, supply armies, and maintain plantations in the absence of drafted men. The Union, by contrast, increasingly relied on wage labor and the mobilization of freed or escaped African Americans in support roles, which both expanded Northern manpower and further linked the conflict to the question of slavery as an economic institution. The use of labor illustrates the tangible ways in which moral and economic factors converged on the battlefield and behind the lines. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 offers another lens to examine this intersection. While commonly viewed as a purely moral decision, its timing and scope also reflected strategic and economic considerations. By declaring enslaved people in rebelling states free, Lincoln aimed to weaken the Confederate economy, disrupt the plantation labor system, and encourage African Americans to join Union forces. The proclamation reframed the war in explicitly anti-slavery terms, enhancing Northern moral legitimacy domestically and internationally. Yet it also addressed the economic reality that undermining the South's labor base could accelerate military victory. In this sense, morality and economic calculation were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. International perspectives further highlight the interplay between morality and economics. European powers, particularly Britain and France, had strong economic interests in Southern cotton, but were increasingly wary of supporting a slaveholding confederation openly. Northern moral arguments against slavery, combined with the Union's naval blockade of Southern ports, disrupted Southern trade and demonstrated how economic leverage could enforce political and ethical objectives. The South's hopes for intervention based on economic dependence were frustrated by moral pressure and strategic blockade, showing once again that economic stakes were inseparable from ideological and political considerations. Internal dissent and public opinion also reflected this dual dynamic. In both North and South, economic hardship influenced popular support for the war. Northern industrial workers faced inflation, conscription, and labor unrest, prompting debates over government policy, wage rights, and draft exemptions. Southern civilians contended with food shortages, inflation, and the conscription of enslaved and free labor. Economic pressure shaped perceptions of the conflict, determining levels of loyalty, resistance, and morale. Political rhetoric frequently invoked both moral imperatives and economic survival, blending justifications for the war with arguments about the material well-being of communities. The wartime economy also reshaped regional development. In the North, the war stimulated industrial expansion, infrastructure investment, and technological innovation. Railroads, ironworks, and munitions factories grew rapidly, creating long-term economic shifts that would influence post-war development. In the South, the destruction of infrastructure, loss of enslaved labor, and blockade-induced shortages devastated agriculture and limited industrialization. Post-war reconstruction efforts reflected these underlying economic realities, as well as the lingering moral and social questions regarding emancipation, labor relations, and civil rights. The interdependence of moral change and economic necessity became clear. The end of slavery was both a human rights victory and a transformation of the Southern economic system. Political maneuvering within Congress and state governments further reveals the economic dimension. Debates over appropriations, conscription laws, and post-war planning frequently centered on the allocation of resources, compensation for loyalists, and the restructuring of labor systems. Northern legislators supported policies that encouraged industrial growth, infrastructure development, and federal investment, often linking these initiatives to the moral justification for Union preservation. Southern legislators, whether in Confederate assemblies or post-war governments, argued for the protection of property and compensation for the loss of enslaved labor, highlighting the centrality of economic concerns even in discussions framed by moral claims. Military strategies themselves reflected economic realities. Union generals prioritized control of transportation hubs, industrial centers, and agricultural regions that could support armies logistically and economically. Confederate leaders, understanding their limited industrial capacity, emphasized defensive operations and hoped to leverage foreign dependence on cotton. Both sides recognized that the ability to sustain armies depended on access to resources, labor, and infrastructure. These operational decisions reveal that economic and moral considerations were inseparable in shaping the course of the war. Social and technological changes accelerated by the war also intersected with the economic and moral dimensions of the conflict. The mobilization of large armies required innovations in logistics, communication, and medical care, while simultaneously disrupting traditional labor systems. The war accelerated the use of African American labor in both military and civilian contexts, creating new opportunities and social tensions. Northern industrial expansion and Southern economic devastation would shape the United States for decades to come, demonstrating that the consequences of the war were both moral and material.
By examining these factors, it becomes evident that the Civil War cannot be understood as solely a moral crusade against slavery or purely a struggle over economic advantage. Rather, it was a convergence of both, with economic structures, resource distribution, labor systems, and industrial capacity shaping the ways in which moral and political arguments were made, received, and acted upon. The interplay of these elements determined strategy, policy, and the ultimate outcome of the conflict. In the final part, we will bring these threads together to examine how the war's conclusion, emancipation, and reconstruction reveal the inseparability of slavery, economics, and national transformation. As the Civil War drew toward its conclusion in 1865, the interwoven nature of economic imperatives and moral objectives became increasingly clear. The Union's victory was not solely the result of battlefield prowess or ideological conviction. It was deeply dependent on the North's industrial strength, its capacity to mobilize resources, and its ability to sustain a long-term war effort. Factories produced weapons and uniforms at unprecedented rates, railroads carried troops and supplies across vast distances, and the federal government leveraged its financial system to fund the conflict. These advantages created the material foundation for victory, while the moral argument against slavery, amplified by the Emancipation Proclamation, provided political legitimacy, rallied public support, and encouraged international recognition. In other words, economic and moral factors operated in tandem, each reinforcing the other. The Southern economy, by contrast, had been severely constrained from the outset. Reliant on a monoculture of cash crops and enslaved labor, the Confederacy lacked both industrial capacity and diversified infrastructure. Its hopes for international intervention based on European dependence on cotton were frustrated by Union blockades and diplomatic maneuvering. Inflation spiraled as the Confederacy issued unbacked currency, eroding public confidence and undermining civilian morale. Enslaved labor, while still producing wealth in plantations, could not be fully leveraged for industrial or military needs, leaving the South at a systemic disadvantage. These economic limitations intertwined with the moral institution of slavery, highlighting that the preservation of bondage was both an ideological aim and a crucial component of the Southern war strategy. The abolition of slavery, formalized in the 13th Amendment, was the ultimate moral and economic transformation of the war. Emancipation was not only a humanitarian milestone, but also a profound restructuring of Southern economic systems. Land that had depended on enslaved labor now required new labor arrangements, wage systems, and social hierarchies. For the North, emancipation enhanced labor mobility and allowed African Americans to contribute to the economy as free citizens, and in some cases as military and civilian workers supporting the Union effort. This dual transformation underscores the extent to which moral objectives and economic imperatives were inseparable. Ending slavery reshaped labor markets, property relations, and the distribution of economic power across the nation. Reconstruction, while intended to address moral and social questions, also reflected deep economic considerations. Federal policies sought not only to integrate freed people into civic life, but also to rebuild the devastated Southern economy and align it more closely with Northern industrial and financial interests. Land reform, infrastructure investment, and labor regulation were intended to stabilize the post-war economy, though implementation was uneven and often contested. Economic recovery and social reform were thus linked. Moral objectives could not be fully realized without addressing the structural economic imbalances that had helped fuel the conflict. The interplay between morality and economics continued to shape political debates well beyond the battlefield. Political outcomes during and after the war further illuminate this dynamic. The expansion of federal authority, the creation of a national banking system, and the passage of tariffs and infrastructure legislation strengthened the Union's economic framework. These measures were justified as necessary for national survival and reconstruction, but they also reflected broader economic strategy. Northern politicians recognized that preserving the moral imperative of union and the abolition of slavery required an economic system capable of sustaining a modern, industrialized nation. Conversely, Southern resistance to Reconstruction policies often stemmed from concerns that economic transformation would permanently undermine the power of the traditional planter class, again highlighting the entwinement of economic and moral interests.
The international perspective offers additional insight. European powers, particularly Britain and France, monitored the war not only for moral considerations regarding slavery, but also for economic opportunities and trade interests. While many European elites were morally opposed to slavery, their industrial economies were connected to Southern cotton. The Union's naval blockade and diplomatic strategy effectively leveraged moral arguments to achieve economic and strategic objectives, discouraging foreign intervention. This interaction illustrates how morality and economics were not simply parallel forces, but mutually reinforcing tools in both domestic and international arenas. The human dimension also cannot be overlooked. Millions of enslaved people, wage laborers, and soldiers experienced the war not only as a moral and political struggle, but as an economic one. African Americans seized opportunities to escape bondage, join Union forces, and negotiate labor arrangements that would secure their livelihoods in a transformed society. Northern laborers and soldiers balanced patriotic and moral commitment with economic necessity, while Southern civilians contended with food shortages, inflation, and the collapse of traditional labor systems. The lived experience of the war demonstrates that economic survival, moral conviction, and political action were inseparable in shaping decisions and allegiances. By examining these intersecting forces, it becomes clear that framing the Civil War solely as a moral crusade against slavery oversimplifies a far more complex reality. Slavery was central, but it was inseparable from the economic, political, and strategic calculations of both North and South. Moral arguments provided justification and legitimacy, while economic imperatives determined the capacity to wage war, mobilize resources, and shape the post-war order. Ignoring either dimension leaves an incomplete picture of why the war occurred, how it was fought, and what consequences it produced for the nation. In conclusion, the American Civil War was neither exclusively about morality nor solely about economics. It was a multifaceted conflict in which the fight over human bondage intersected with industrial capacity, infrastructure, trade, political representation, and labor systems. The war's causes, course, and consequences cannot be fully understood without acknowledging how these forces reinforced and constrained each other. Slavery, while a moral issue, was also an economic linchpin. Economic interests, while material, were defended and contested in moral terms. Recognizing this interplay allows us to see the Civil War as a complex national crisis, one shaped by both the human imperative for freedom and the material realities of a divided nation. As the war formally ended in 1865, the consequences of the conflict illuminated the inseparability of slavery and economics more clearly than ever before. The Southern economy lay in ruins, plantations were destroyed, enslaved labor had been abolished, and capital that had once been concentrated in land and human property evaporated. This economic devastation forced a rethinking of social structures, labor systems, and regional economic models. Freed African Americans sought land, employment, and political representation, challenging the old economic hierarchies. Northern and Southern policies attempted to reconcile these moral demands with economic necessity, often imperfectly.
Sharecropping, tenant farming, and wage labor systems became the new economic structures of the South, reflecting compromises between moral ideals of freedom and the economic realities of agricultural production. These arrangements illustrate that the consequences of slavery and its abolition were always both ethical and economic in nature. Even decades later, the debates over the Civil War's causes and consequences reflect this duality. Public memory often frames the war as a moral crusade against slavery, emphasizing the ethical imperative while simplifying the economic stakes. Yet primary sources, from declarations of secession to contemporary newspaper accounts, reveal that Southern leaders were acutely aware of the economic foundations of slavery and the implications of losing it. Northern leaders, while morally opposed to slavery, also recognized the strategic and economic advantages of preserving the Union and reshaping the labor system. By integrating economic analysis with moral and political considerations, historians gain a fuller understanding of the war's complexity. The broader lesson of the Civil War is that major historical conflicts are rarely reducible to a single cause or explanation. In this case, moral outrage over slavery cannot be separated from economic self-interest, political power, and structural inequality. Both factors shape the motivations, strategies, and outcomes of the conflict. Recognizing this interplay does not diminish the moral significance of emancipation. Rather, it provides a more nuanced understanding of the forces that drove one of the most transformative events in American history. Economic structures influenced political choices, while moral imperatives shaped strategic decisions, demonstrating that the two were intertwined at every level of the conflict.
In reflecting on the Civil War, we are left with enduring questions that continue to challenge simplistic narratives. How did economic dependence on slavery influence the South's decision to secede? How did industrial capacity and resource distribution shape the Union's strategy and success? And to what extent can moral progress be sustained without corresponding economic transformation? These questions remind us that history is rarely a matter of straightforward cause and effect. Instead, it is the product of interacting systems, human decisions, and conflicting priorities, each shaping the other in ways that continue to reverberate long after the final shots were fired. Ultimately, the American Civil War was both a moral and economic revolution. Slavery, while a profound ethical wrong, was also a cornerstone of Southern economic power. Economic disparities and industrial capacity shaped the strategies, capabilities, and outcomes of the conflict, while moral imperatives provided the framework for emancipation and post-war reconstruction. Understanding the war requires seeing these forces not as competing explanations, but as mutually dependent dimensions of a single historical reality. In this sense, the story of the Civil War challenges us to appreciate the complexity of history, where morality and economics are not separate threads, but intertwined forces that define nations and shape human lives.